Okay, so hello and welcome. We are going to get started. As folks join, I will try to let them in, but I'm doing a couple different things here, so bear with me. As we get started, just a reminder, we are recording this so we can share it out with folks afterwards. We also have enabled instant closed captioning by rev.com. So you should be able to see that button available. I am going to actually stop sharing for just a brief moment and introduce you all to our two guests today. So we have David Holland, who is the Deputy Director of West Staff. Hello, David. Thank you for joining us. And then we also have Matt Irish, who is the managing partner at O'Neill & Associates, a lobbying firm in Massachusetts, who works quite closely with Mass Creative. So hello, Matt. Matt, thanks for joining us today. All right. So we are going to do a couple of things today. We're going to give you a little bit of a summary of election results on both the federal and state levels. Then we're also going to talk about what does that mean, right? Like, what does it mean to have for Democrats to have control of the Senate, the U.S. Senate, but not the U.S. House? What does it mean in Massachusetts to have Democrats in control of the executive and legislative branches? How can we as advocates be more effective in our work in terms of engaging newly elected officials, of which in Massachusetts we have many on the state level? What are the policies that we should be looking out for, and how is that process going to work? So we've got a robust agenda today. And so without further ado, I'm going to get us started. Feel free to use the chat along the way. If you have questions, I'll be monitoring that. We also had folks who asked questions when you registered, and I'm going to try to make sure we cover those as well. So here we go. So first off, let's start on the federal level with the Senate results. So we know that as of the other day, when Nevada results came in, that Democrats will control the Senate, continuing control from last session. In Massachusetts, our two U.S. senators are Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Edward Markey, neither of which were up for re-election this year or this election cycle. You can see underneath what their election dates are. And we've also listed here all of the current committees that they serve on and the subcommittees that they chair. So that's who represents us on the federal level for the Senate. On the House, right, we're still waiting to see results come in. This is pulled from the New York Times as of yesterday at 5 p.m. And we know that there's been a couple more seats decided. But in Massachusetts, get ready for this, no surprise here, our entire delegation is part of the Democratic Party. Currently, right, until the new Congress is seated, the Democrats are in leadership. And so Representative Richard Neal, Congressman Neal is chair of Ways and Means. Congressman McGovern is chair of Rules. Congresswoman Trahan is a member of Committee of Energy and Commerce. Again, here, there's more. Congressman Auchincloss, Congresswoman Catherine Clark, who is also Assistant Speaker. So she's part of Nancy Pelosi's leadership team. And then Congressman Moulton, who is up representing the North Shore. And then finally, we have Congresswoman Presley, Congressman Lynch, who is also chair of the National Security Subcommittee, and Congressman Keating, who is the chair of the Europe Energy, the Environment and Cyber Security Subcommittee. So those are the folks who represent us on the federal level. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that David can give us more of an in-depth look about what do those results mean. So I'm going to stop sharing. David, feel free to put your slides up.
All right, thanks, Emily. And hopefully you all will be able to see this, and this is all functioning correctly. Am I good? Can you see this?
You are.
Great. Awesome. So I'm going to start with kind of what some perspectives are based on our analysis of the results and of the environment in Congress in terms of active pieces of legislation or recent pieces of legislation that have focused on the creative economy, which includes arts and culture. So one of the things that you'll see as I move on, and I will ask you to forgive me for moving through this very quickly, but there's a lot to cover in a short space of time. But our first observation is that the current pieces of legislation, which there's at least 22 active pieces of legislation in Congress that relate to the creative economy, that most of them have very limited chance of actually passing, particularly on their own, but even as part of like a larger appropriations bill. So that's where we are now. So what we need is to activate our congressional delegations, in this case in Massachusetts, but really across the country, if we want any of these to be successful in whatever way it might be. And we'll come on to that later. When you look at those pieces of legislation, none of them were introduced by members of your delegation. And actually few of them were co-sponsored by members of your delegation. So there is an opportunity there to engage your delegation around advocating in support of arts and culture and the creative economy in Congress. So that's an opportunity. Another thing that we often look at West Staff when we're talking to our stakeholders is, of course, dynamics like those that I mentioned, but also who is in a position where they're an authorizer or where they have influence over processes that could have any of this legislation be successful, and that could have an increase in appropriations to any of the federal cultural agencies. So I've listed those here. There are a number of committees, which I will come on to, which are relevant to these pieces of legislation. So this sort of outlines who some of your targets might be in that sense. So in the Senate, Edward Markey is on small business and entrepreneurship, which is a committee in which a number of pieces of legislation are being considered. Similarly, House Financial Services Committee is another committee that's considering legislation or that would consider legislation if it were to move forward in the process. And there are a number of representatives there, which Emily outlined and is part of her presentation, and those are just elaborated here in more detail, including the vice chair of that committee. And then House Appropriations, Representative Clark, who, as Emily said, also has a leadership position. So it's important, these give you some targets and those who you might think about engaging because they have an influence over bill passage and appropriations. So that's kind of the summary to set things out. That's like, if there are big takeaways from what I'm gonna say, this is the summary of all of that at the very beginning. And then I'll just briefly take you through some other things. I'm not gonna describe this entire chart, but this is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts to share with their stakeholders about the appropriations process. And this is typically the process that appropriations go through, and you can see the complexity of it. Often the field waits to see what the White House proposes before taking further action. So that's our first step, and that's the first step that you'll see here. Then essentially the Senate and the House consider the White House's request, the president's request, and then it goes through various processes, which eventually lead into appropriations subcommittees, which focus on particular cultural agencies. And for the National Endowment for the Arts, that's interiors in basically the House and the Senate. It eventually goes there, and then it gets put together as part of a comprehensive appropriation package that's passed. There's also, and I'll share in the chat after I'm finished, there is like a standard timeline supposedly to the appropriations process. But the way Congress has worked for a very long time is that that traditional timeline or expected timeline is not adhered to. It's often not adhered to by the White House, and it's not adhered to by Congress as well. So we often enter a new Congress without the budget resolved. So that is now part of the process as we have it today. But I will share with you that traditional timeline of what it is supposed to look like and what's supposed to happen, although it essentially never happens anymore, because of course it's a very political process. But what the Arts Endowment has provided is useful because they don't actually put the timings, they just put the general stages of the process, which still do apply for sure. So right now, a focus associated with appropriations is on the federal cultural agency budgets. And by that, I mean the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The way the field approaches this request is that there be parity between the budgets of the two agencies. There have been some issues in recent years with different budget proposals for the different agencies, but the field's approach is that they have the same budget level. And so what we're currently requesting to resolve the budget for fiscal year 23, which is not resolved, is $207 million for each of the federal cultural agencies, in this case, meaning the Arts and Humanities endowments. And that is the level that the House essentially agreed to when they went through their process. So it's requesting that the Senate match that. I think the proposal that the Senate has put forward is much less. So there is pretty significant advocacy currently to have them agree to this higher level. It probably won't be 207 million, but the idea here is to get them up higher than where they are, which I think is in the 180s at the moment. And some of the messaging that's used, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but there is messaging that's commonly used about how the federal cultural agencies leverage the funds well and show good governance, because actually $9 is invested for every $1 of federal investment, which is very significant. And that plays well, especially, it plays well across the board, but it plays well especially to conservatives, that particular messaging. The field has articulated, I think for the first time clearly, a goal that we have per capita indexing, as it's called, of the federal cultural agencies, meaning that there's $1 per capita. As population increases, their budgets would automatically adjust to account for the $1 per capita. So that's the long-term goal, which has now actually been articulated to Congress clearly. And the rest of it is just that there is a gap. The Arts Endowment is only able to fund a small fraction of the applications that it receives. And so it's not fully able to address the needs of the field on any basis currently. So there we go. That's that. And we do need to engage and activate our networks around the appropriations process. So there is a time, this is very timely, and this is an important time to do that. And I'm sure Emily can describe later ways that you can engage through Mass Creative to do just that. So this is just like a visual. WestStaff tracks a lot of legislation in Congress. Currently, we're tracking 22 pieces of legislation, which I briefly mentioned before. I could not possibly go into all of these, so I'm not, but the slides will be provided to you and you can explore. And a link to that tracker will be provided as well, which is something that you can download the data yourself. You can also like click through with live links in that tracker and find out more about the legislation. But we basically did an analysis of that whole portfolio to just show you some things and to make clear why we offer the perspectives we did at the beginning of this presentation. So one is that, largely speaking, all of those 22 pieces of legislation, about 23% of that is bipartisan or Republican only. Around 77% of that is Democrats in terms of who introduced the legislation and who the co-sponsors of the legislation are. So hopefully that's clear. So we have a lot of support from the Democrats, our field, for legislation, and a bit less so from Republicans. And there are reasons for that. Some of them are ideological reasons and fiscal reasons. Some of them also, to be honest, may have to do with how some of us, this is not the case for Massachusetts because their entire delegation is Democrats, but some of our states could do better at engaging their delegations who have significant Republican members who might be more sympathetic to our case. So the party affiliation of bill sponsors is kind of even more dramatic. 90% of those who introduced legislation were Democrats. Over 90%, 9% were Republicans. So that's where we are. So that shows kind of for those who have Republican members of Congress, what the work is ahead for us as a field. I'll say that. As I mentioned before, Massachusetts members haven't been as supportive of creative economy legislation as other members across the country. So when you look at this, only 18% of those pieces of legislation had a Massachusetts co-sponsor. So there is an opportunity to engage your delegation more about supporting these pieces of legislation if it's of interest to them. And I've outlined here the representatives in Congress that supported various pieces of legislation. So it's important on the Senate side and on the House side. These are some of the committees, and I won't go through this in a lot of detail, but this is how we came up with at the beginning, like who some of your targets should be. These are some of the most relevant committees related to the legislation that's currently under consideration. So small business and entrepreneurship in the Senate, which I mentioned before, appropriations and finance in the Senate as well. And then in the House, there's like a broader range of committees, but education and labor is very significant in relation to this portfolio of legislation, this 22 pieces of legislation that we're tracking. And then financial services, as I mentioned before, you have a number of members on that committee. So this gives you avenues to have conversations about the legislation in question with those members. Small business in the House as well, and then appropriations, of course. So those are committees. This is the status of those 22 pieces of legislation, which I think is also important to understand. A lot has been introduced and a lot has not moved further in the process. So 18% has been referred to committee. So that gives you an idea of the trajectory for these pieces of legislation, and it's something that we have to think about. Again, I feel that the proliferation of legislation in Congress is a good sign that we have engagement, interest, that members of Congress are taking seriously their responsibility and leadership as arts advocates. But if we want any of this to be successful, we will have to develop and refine our strategies and really put our weight behind what is most important to us. And I think that this is going to bring me to my conclusion. We look at something called GovTrack that gives a prognosis for legislation. And they've developed this regression model. I think that they were the first to do it, at least certainly openly, I would say that, and present it to the public. And it's very interesting. And they basically analyze legislation for years to develop this model. But in any case, if you look at the 22 pieces of legislation, the vast majority of them have a 4% prognosis, which essentially means they have a very slim chance of passage. So this kind of outlines where we are across the portfolio. I think it's good to put it into context though, with this statement from them, which is that more than 10,000 bills will be considered in each Congress and only 7% will become law. So we definitely need to be focused and think about what it is that we want to achieve. I think that one way of thinking about it, legislation puts a spotlight on issues, actually allows members of Congress to speak about the importance of certain issues, which has value in and of itself. But certainly if we want to see these pieces of legislation pass and have an impact on appropriations, we will need to engage our members of Congress about what is important to us. And with that, I will end my comments. And thank you for welcoming me into this space and inviting me to speak with you today.
No, David, thank you. That was fantastic. I really, really appreciate it. So already we have one question from the chat, which is from Blair, who wanted to know which bill was deemed to have a 13% chance. Which one's got the best odds?
Yes, let me just look at I'll have to remind myself by looking at my spread sheet because there's a lot of information here. Give me just one moment.
Well, while you were doing that, I will also just as a quick reminder, sort of draw a clear line between the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities and Massachusetts, right? So the amount of money that's appropriated or allocated to the, okay, so it's Transportation, Housing, Urban Development, and Related Agency Appropriation Act.
And I can add just one comment to why that has a higher rate is because it's not actually specific only to this. Does that make sense? To the creative economy? It's a broader appropriations package that's under consideration. So that's why.
There you go. That's helpful. Thanks, David. So to remind, the money that's appropriated or allocated to the National Endowment for the Arts actually gets divided into two pots. So 60% of it goes to the National Endowment for the Arts for grant making and operations. The other 40% goes to state arts agencies. So Mass Cultural Council directly receives dollars from the National Endowment for the Arts for its work, and the National Endowment and the Mass Humanities receives dollars from the National Endowment for the Humanities, right? Furthermore, we also know, right, that there's a program at the Mass Cultural Council, the local cultural councils. And so those, again, some of those dollars are making their way directly to every city and town in Massachusetts. So the idea that arts, you know, that the National Endowment for the Arts is just doing very complicated application grant making is not true, right? There's a direct impact in arts funding in Massachusetts with the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. I also want to just ask, so David, take out your crystal ball for a second. So we're going to have a divided Congress. And for, you know, as you pointed out, there's been a super proliferation of art spills that have come up. But as a new Congress is seated, does this make our job harder? Does it make it the same? Does it make it easier given the makeup of Congress and the president?
I think it remains to be seen in some ways. I'll try to split up my thoughts based on the results and where everything stands. So one is, I think the White House, we have clear support and leadership in supporting arts, culture, creative economy. So that is clear. And that support extends to the federal cultural agencies, the reestablishment of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, all of these things. There's been an executive order, all of those things have happened. So I think that there's firm support there. And some of that is transformational because of the administration's support in advancing equity. That is definitely following through to the National Endowment for the Arts and giving them a platform to do some agency transformation that many feel is much needed. So there's that. So that the outlook for that is positive. And there are some commitments to making enhancements to the agency's budget, and so they have the support of the White House. I'll say that, especially the Arts Endowment, but both the Arts and Humanities endowments do. So there's that. I think that the Democrats being in control of the Senate could have a positive influence in some ways, because, like, as we saw, most of the legislation being introduced is actually introduced by Democrats. So there's ways to leverage their leadership in the Senate to our advantage in various ways. I think the House speaks to what I was talking about some of the challenges potentially ahead. And in some ways, people speak of like the House as being overall, like as a body, a bit less conservative than the Senate. We see that even with this appropriations discussion around the Arts and Humanities endowments budgets. And so the House is really what we have to play for. And I think as a field, again, this doesn't actually pertain as particularly to Massachusetts because of the composition of your delegation and overall. But in other states, I think the work that we've been talking about in the field of how do we engage conservatives will become even more critical. If you were to actually like look deeper into, which you can in the links that I'll provide to you, those pieces of legislation, even the ones that are bipartisan, typically bipartisan means that they have one Republican co-sponsor. So the work
Takes is one.
so the work on that side is fairly significant. And there will be, I imagine, because of the rebalancing of the House, there will definitely be even more robust debates and conflict, to be quite honest, around appropriations, for sure. And like, I'm sure you all know this, but often investment in arts and culture is characterized by conservatives as a misuse of public investment, unfortunately. So there are many cases in which it's put forward that these enhanced investments, even during COVID, to support the relief and recovery of the sector, were characterized as irresponsible public spending. So we do have to work on our messaging and engagement, and we will have to definitely be actively involved in the House. What I also will say, which this is obvious, and you all will have observed this, it's not overwhelming what's happened in the House. So it's not as if there won't be strong support to be leveraged there, but we will have to put more attention on how we engage Republicans and Republican leadership, for sure.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to a look at the state level, does anyone have any final questions around federal work for our dear friend David? Yep. Got it. Okay, so my quick takeaways are, we have a really great opportunity to engage all of our members of Congress and turn them into arts champions. We've got a few who are already there. I will give a call out to Congressman McGovern, who has been a stalwart supporter of arts and culture, and in fact introduced an amendment to a labor and workforce bill that actually intentionally focuses on creative economy work recently. So we've got some, but we got to get them all. And that the NEA appropriation is sort of the biggest thing that we can be talking to them about now. So I'll get to how we'll do that in a little bit, but those are some of the takeaways. The other takeaway is there's a lot of bills that focus on the arts and cultural community. And there are just a lot of bills, period. And so not a lot of bills have a chance of passing, but if we can sort of coalesce our energies around some specific asks, we might have a better shot. And we have the infrastructure with our congressional delegation to really do that. And we have an executive branch on the federal level who is very supportive of arts and culture, and we should not take that for granted. So those are my takeaways. So great. Okay, David, thank you so much for your time. If you're able to stick around, that would be great, but I'm going to switch our focus to the state level. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again if I remember how. One moment. Okay. So we had a bit of an historic election last week where Massachusetts elected not only its first female governor, who was elected. Obviously, Governor Swift was governor, but she was not elected. She filled in when Governor Cellucci left. Well, yeah, and that, but Maura Healey, Governor-elect Maura Healey, is also the first openly LGBTQ plus member or governor in Massachusetts. And so that is really exciting. We also know that our lieutenant governor-elect is Kim Driscoll, former, or for the next month and a half, mayor of Salem. And, you know, throughout the Create the Vote campaign, we had the opportunity to hear from both Maura Healey and Kim Driscoll about how they absolutely see arts and culture as a central part of what makes Massachusetts a great place to live and to work. We also know from her work in Salem that Lieutenant Governor-elect Driscoll certainly knows how to implement creative placemaking and creative placekeeping strategies that advance a stronger arts and cultural sector. So I'm really excited. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Further down the list are the rest of our state constitutional officers, include Attorney General-elect Andrea Campbell, former Boston City Councilor, State Treasurer Deborah Goldberg, who is the incumbent in this position, and then State Auditor-elect Diana DeZoglio, who most recently was a state senator. The other incumbent in this portfolio is Secretary of the Commonwealth or Secretary of State, William Galvin, who Matt, is he in his 17th term?
Yeah,
I'm joking.
Yeah, he's the longest serving constitutional officer in state history. I want to say it's 6 or 7 terms at this point. So there's Bill Galvin.
Yes, and Bill Galvin is passionate, as I've experienced, about 2 central issues. The first one is the census, very excited about census and census participation, and then also making sure elections are transparent and making sure that votes get counted. So we do have someone in that office who's doing great work. And we have people who are going to be doing great work in all of these offices. I want to toggle back for a second to just talk for a minute about the governor and lieutenant governor, right? Because in Massachusetts, for a very long time, and Matt will get into this in a little bit in his analysis, we've had a Republican governor and then a very Democratic legislature. And so for a lot, and we also have, for better or worse, we've had a governor who certainly appreciates arts and culture, but has not made arts and culture a priority in his administration, and has not had cabinet secretaries who have built out sort of larger integrated strategies around arts and culture. So frankly, Mass Creative has not spent a lot of time advocating to the executive branch. We spent most of our time working with the legislature around the allocation of dollars. That's the job of the legislature, to decide how the money is going to get spent, and then also passing pieces of policy that would encourage a stronger, more inclusive and equitable arts and cultural sector. But the governor and the executive branch has real impact on the arts and cultural sector, right? So, underneath the governor are many cabinets, including right now housing and economic development. And inside of economic development, there's the potential opportunity, and we saw it in the past, for more of a focus around creative economy development. The Secretary of Labor, right? We can talk about labor and workforce, which is also crosses over into economic development. There are agencies within Massachusetts that focus on that and focus on how to invest dollars to train people up for jobs, and thinking about how we can actually really potentially think about how to train people up for creative jobs or creative skills that young people are learning for other jobs, right? That's a both and, right? That there's opportunity there. The other thing is, right, is that the governor and lieutenant governor produce a budget every year. And last year we celebrated, because I think for the first time in a very long time, the governor's budget didn't cut the arts and cultural the allocation for arts and culture, right? But what would it look like if we have a governor who puts out a very visionary goal for art spending in Massachusetts? Like, I think there's a possibility there if we do some more dedicated and focused advocacy around there. So now I'm going to move us to our state elected officials. On the Senate level, the makeup of the, sorry, my dog is very excited about state politics. The makeup of the Senate is going to be 37 Democrats and 3 Republicans. There were 5 newly elected members of the Senate. You can see them here. I want to point out these 2 in particular, right? So Senator-elect Mark, who was most recently was a state rep, and Senator-elect Oliveira, who also was most recently a state rep. They are taking over 2 very important Senate seats, right? Senator-elect Mark is going to represent all of Berkshire County. And we know that there is an enormous amount of cultural activity and arts happening out there. Senator Oliveira is taking over, I believe it's she'll be senator for another few moments. Chandler, who is the Senate President Emeritus. Is that correct, Matt, or am I screwing?
No, that's no. Jake's taking over Eric Lesser's seat.
Right. Thank you.
And Robin's taking over Harley Chandler's seat.
Great. Thank you very much for the correction. Senator Chandler's seat is going to be taken over by Senator-elect Robin Kennedy. And then Senator Lesser's seat will be Senator-elect Oliveira. Senator Lesser has been a stalwart champion for arts and culture since the days when he was the co-chair of Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development. Also, another former chair of Arts and Cultural Development was Senator Hines, who Senator-elect Mark is taking over his seat. So it's kind of important to note we have lost two very important champions in the Senate for arts and culture, and we're going to have to think about how we can build that back, right? On the House side, a lot more transition. So I hope you can see this slide. And if you have a district, if you have a new legislator, you can check out to see who they are. These slides are all available. We'll be sending out a note afterwards, so you can take a look and go through this entire list. But we have 132 Democrats, 25 Republicans, and 1 independent. That's the makeup of the House. So what this means is in both the House and the Senate, we will have super majorities. And Matt will talk for a brief moment about what that means. Very quickly, before we move over to Matt, I'm just going to remind us there were 4 ballot questions. Question 1 was about the Fair Share Amendment, which was having a higher tax rate for incomes over $1 million. That passed. The regulation of dental insurance passed by a very large margin, which was question 2. Question 3 had to do with the sale of alcohol and the distribution of liquor licenses. That did not pass. 53% said no. And then finally, question 4, which makes sure that folks who are not living legally in the United States can still access a driver's license to make sure we are all safer and that they can be part of our communities, did pass as well. So that is my very quick recap. Yes. But before we get into this, I'm going to stop. And Matt, let's talk about what this means in terms of the makeup of the various branches of government.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And good to see you on a screen. So, I mean, I think Emily really kind of hit it when, since the Dukakis administration in the late 80s, this is only the second time we've had, a Democrat in the executive office, as governor. So, the last time obviously was the Patrick Murray administration. But other than that, all those times in between, it's been a Republican governor and Democratic legislature. So I think it's really an open question as to kind of what that looks like. I think, there's, and I know there's some folks on this who spent some time. I see Beth Ann Steiner's on here. So I know there's folks that have spent a considerable amount of time in the building. So they've kind of have lived through this experience themselves where, people come in and they're like, all right, this is going to be great. We've got a Democratic governor. We've got everyone's Democrat and, the legislature's Democrat. So much stuff's going to get done. And then that doesn't happen. What ends up happening is, because the Democratic Party is so monolithic in the state, and because the Republican Party in our state has pretty much set itself on fire, and doesn't really meaningfully exist at this point or function. What ends up happening is, the majority party, because it's such a big tent party, it becomes less about kind of party affiliation and more other kind of variables play into things, such as, personality, such as, progressives versus moderates versus conservatives, regional politics. All these things kind of play into it, and it's really unclear, because we've only experienced it once. I mean, definitely when going back to the early days of the Patrick administration, it was a bumpy start with the governor and legislative leadership, because I think they were all trying to kind of assert primacy of kind of who was really in charge. At that point, you had a very powerful House Speaker, you had a very powerful Senate President, kind of both at that point kind of operating at the top of their games. And then you had Governor Patrick, who came in with a landslide, and it was there was a lot of kind of positioning going on. I think it'll be a little different this cycle. I think Attorney General Healy, is someone who, kind of, don't forget when she came in as kind of a relative unknown and she became Attorney General. I mean, in that campaign, she won a massive upset victory against, a kind of a can't lose candidate, at that point, who everyone kind of, with whom that Warren Tolman was going to be the Attorney General, and Maura Healey, ran an incredible race, and she took over, and she really has done a great job as AG. She really has. She's also, another kind of distinction is she's the first attorney general, I think going back over 100 years or so, that has ever successfully run from attorney general to become governor. Many have tried. We had Scott Harshbarger, we had Tom Riley, we had Martha Coakley. The joke is AG stands for almost governor in Massachusetts, because none of them were successful, and more kind of broke the curse. So I think that I think it will be different, but I do expect that because her election was she cleared the Democratic primary field, and she essentially had kind of token Republican opposition with Jeff Deal. It'll be interesting to see. She hasn't had to face a lot of adversity, candidly, in her run for statewide office, and so a lot of kind of specific questions on kind of how she's going to handle specific policy, are a little bit up in the air at this point. I think that I don't think we'll see some of the, rookie mistakes that maybe you saw with the previous Democratic administration, because she is someone who has worked over years as Attorney General to really develop strong and meaningful relationships with the legislature. She's had a lot of success in not only as the people's attorney, but also on the policy side too. She has a lot of things she can point to where she was actively engaged, whether it was criminal justice reform, whether it was on issues of gun violence prevention, whether it's on issues of climate change. She's really played an active role with the legislature, and I think that helps to develop those critical relationships with House and Senate leadership. I think the other thing as we kind of go into this is we're going to see a number of legislators who have been around, likely get pulled into the administration in kind of meaningful roles, whether they be cabinet secretaries, whether they be heads of agencies, working directly in the governor's office. And I think it's going to lead to a lot of change, a lot of special elections. I mean, the Healy folks are really smart. The Healy Driscoll folks are really smart. And they're not going to be pulling backbenchers out of the legislature. They're going to be pulling really smart, capable legislators out of the House and the Senate and bringing them in their administration. So I think that that will be while we're going to see a number of new legislators, as Emily already showed the slide, we're going to see more changes. And every time one of these things happens, is sometimes it's kind of like a domino effect of once if she pulls a senator out, and that means that certain House members may run for the Senate seat, and then that means people from the those local communities will run for the House seat, and it kind of moves the process. I think it really speaks to the Democratic Party really has a much deeper bench than the Republican Party, and you'll see a lot of talented people run for those open positions. I think that so I expect there to be a lot of activity there, and I think that between now and the end of the year, there's a number of kind of things that the legislature is still going to do between until the new legislature comes in early January. But I think that we're going to see a lot on the transition front, and I also think once we get into January, when the new legislature is sworn in, you're going to see a lot of these kind of special elections, that type of thing. It will happen. So I think people should be prepared for a lot of change. The legislature, has kind of the culture of the legislature has changed over the last, I'd say, 10 years or so, and especially over the last couple of years with the pandemic. But people don't stick around as long as they used to. There tends to be more movement in the legislature than there was in the past. It's something along the lines of 40 to 50% of the House is served for 5 years or less. So it's really, really important that, from an advocacy standpoint, that there's a you can't look at it as, hey, you had a conversation with legislator, House or Senate member last session, and one, that they're even still around, or two, that that you need to go back to those folks. It needs to be a kind of a constant care and feeding. If you're not doing that, you're gonna blink, and all the people that are going to be gone. And I think it's really important to kind of as you are looking at, if you're in an area where there's a new legislator, introduce yourself to that new legislator. They'll welcome, they'll certainly welcome you reaching out and kind of start those informal conversations, because we tell folks all the time, the best time to go talk to a legislator is when you don't need anything. You don't want to be in a position where you are, something is critical to you or your organization or your community, and that's the first time you've ever picked up the phone and called your legislator. That's always a tougher conversation than if you had spent, had coffee, gone to office hours, met them at an event in the community, met them out door knocking, that type of thing, or worked on their campaign. It's a lot easier conversation to have. So I really would encourage folks as they're kind of looking at this, to kind of take that approach. We do expect, again, with the administration, we have heard, a lot of rumblings that the governor-elect will seek to reorganize her cabinet. It's a process called an Article 87. It's a fairly, it doesn't happen with every administration, but it happens with a lot of administrations where they'll kind of reshuffle how they want to constitute their cabinet. Typically, the legislature will give the executive, give the governor a wide berth on this, whether the Republican or Democrat. There was a lot of this in the Romney administration. There was a lot of this in the Patrick administration. So I think that we would anticipate that. One of note that we have heard, from a lot of folks is that there could be a move to kind of separate what is now the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development and make housing its own secretariat and economic development its own secretariat. I think that could be something that could be really helpful. As Emily kind of pointed out, obviously the creative economy and having those champions that can kind of focus on that. The governor-elect has identified housing as probably one of the most critical needs of the Commonwealth, the cost of housing. And I think so to have somebody who can focus on, those critical economic development issues, it could be beneficial for us. So that's something to stay tuned on. The other thing too, and we talked about it a little bit, but again, the partisan makeup of the legislature, there's 3 Republicans in the Senate. All kidding aside, 2 of those Republicans are probably Democrats in another state. They're pretty moderate, reasonable people that you can work with. Bruce Tarr, in particular, the Senate Minority Leader, is one of the best people up there to deal with on any number of issues. He's smart and he's thoughtful. And he's got a great staff. And so I would just stress, don't really focus on the party affiliation. Because essentially pretty much everyone's a Democrat. In the House, you do have some more conservative members of their caucus. But again, the majority of the caucus is dominated by moderate Republicans. Brad Jones, who's the Minority Leader, is a very reasonable guy, good to work with. And again, he plays his role in terms of the minority opposition party, the leader of that party. He does a good job with it, given that he doesn't have a lot to work with, in terms of numbers. But they can have an important voice, kind of on the policy side. I think, from what I can tell, Governor-elect Healy really has run as, I think to the dismay of some folks in the progressive community, she's run more as a moderate. And she really kind of staked out that middle ground position. I think you're looking at Governor Baker leaving after 2 terms as still being the most popular governor in the country, with still over 70% approval rating after 8 years. She looked at that, I'm sure, and said, that seems to be working pretty well. I'm going to do more of that. And I think that, that was a real challenge for folks in the primary process, who were kind of definitely more kind of taking a more progressive kind of doctrinaire approach in terms of, we need to change everything. When I think the kind of mood of, despite the fact that we are the most democratic state in the country, the mood, there's a lot of room for a kind of moderate, independent, people that lean, obviously lean Democrat when they vote, but they're not affiliated with either party. Because that's the largest party affiliation in Massachusetts is unenrolled or independent. So it's not, then obviously Democrat, and then there's a couple of Republicans out there. But the other, our legislature remains in this current session until early January. The new legislature does not get sworn in until the first Wednesday in January, which is January 4th. Then the governor will be sworn in, I believe it's on Thursday the 5th. And then her, she will, as Emily kind of noted on the budget, she'll introduce her first budget. Has to be 3 weeks after the legislature is sworn in. So it'll be like the week of the 23rd, I believe, of January is when the governor's budget. And it'll be interesting to see how that works. I think that, kind of big items coming up next session. I think obviously the economy is on everybody's minds, and, the legislature, with record budget surpluses and the infusion of federal money through COVID, we're the state right on paper is in a very strong fiscal position. We ended the year with massive budget surpluses, and as folks are probably aware, they're going to they pay taxes. They're going to be getting a refund on that through this kind of relatively unknown law until this year called 62F. So some folks may have received those, some folks haven't. They will be getting those. And then the question really becomes, what does the next kind of budget cycle look like? I think there's a lot, while there is, the legislature does have a remaining 1.75 billion with a B dollars of unspent ARPA money that needs to be spent. And so I think that, there's that, and, again, tax collections, continue to be robust, but I think that there's a general sense of like, things are going to change quickly. The state has built up a massive rainy day fund. So the state is well positioned for kind of an economic downturn or a slowdown. But I do think it's something that, that's going to kind of be, that'll be a dominating issue as we kind of go into that new session when the budget cycle really starts, and that kind of, our January and our budget cycle, our fiscal year starts on July 1st. So, I mean, that really, is when the new legislature comes in, that really is the kind of the first big thing they work on is the budget, and go in the House when they take it up in April. Senate will take it up in May. They conference the reconcile the budget in June, and get it to the governor. The question really is, what does the legislature do with the Democratic budget? From a Democratic governor. Typically, if it's a Republican budget, they look at it and they say thank you very much, and then do their own budget. And I think it'll be interesting to see that kind of interplay of my sense is again kind of going back where we started. That dynamic between the House Speaker, the Senate President, and the governor and the new governor. So we'll see kind of how that plays out. I think that'll be the most interesting dynamic. It's starting to get some tension in the press. There's been a couple of columns on it. Joan Bonacci's written on it. Commonwealth Magazine has written on it. This dynamic of like, let's see how this kind of plays out. So the other thing I think that we don't know yet with regards to the executive with the new administration is, what's the role of the lieutenant governor? As Kim Driscoll is the mayor of Salem. She's been a very popular, successful mayor. But the lieutenant governor's job, other than the only technical responsibility that the lieutenant governor has is managing, is to chair the governor's council meetings, and if the governor is incapacitated or out of state, that they're in charge. Beyond that, it's very open, and I think folks look at the model that the Baker-Polito administration had, where there was there was a very active engagement by the lieutenant governor, especially in terms of municipal relationships. It was a similar relationship to how in the Patrick Murray administration, how Tim Murray was utilized by Deval Patrick, in that, and they played a very active role. But other lieutenant governors have been haven't been as active, and it really depends. I do think that that my sense, if I had to guess where it goes, I think that Kim Driscoll will play an active role, and in the administration, and I think that's someone, again, some folks on here who are North Shore based probably have a relationship with her. Mayors, my experience, in my hometown of Worcester, the mayor, in the city administration, the arts and culture are incredibly important to kind of the downtown, revitalization and kind of the arts and culture, and have an active voice in our community. I think it's pretty similar in communities up in the North Shore and in Salem and Lynn and other places like that. So I think that that's something that, again, really encourage folks to really kind of be active and engaging with the new administration. There's an opportunity. They've announced, that Kim Driscoll is going to lead the transition team. I think they're trying to flesh out some of the details on that, but there's a website that's been set up that folks can, if they're interested in, playing an active role in transition, there, I'd encourage folks to look at that and, fill out the form they have on the website and kind of get your, I think there'll probably be more people interested than they'll probably select, but I think the first step is, kind of engaging them directly right there. So, so I think that you want to be very, again, see this as an opportunity. Change presents challenges, but it presents opportunities. And I think that's something that we, there's a lot, but I think, big picture items for the legislature. Obviously, the budget we've gone on there. I think there will be another kind of ARPA / eco dev spending bill probably earlier, than maybe than folks would normally be used to, where we tend to do our kind of our big omnibus economic development bill is usually the last thing that gets done on July 31st of the second year session. Didn't really work out so well this year. And I think that, well, now we're past that, but I do think that we'll see that earlier. I do think that we will likely see, given just the number of new legislators, I think you'll likely see changes with regards to, you're going to have a new chair of the Economic Development Committee in the Senate. You're going to have a new chair that, you'll likely have a new chair of the Tourism Committee in both branches. So I do think there's opportunities there for engagement. Emily, what else am I missing? Anything else you want me to touch on?
No, that was great. That was really great. I want to, there are two things that I wanted to pull out really specifically. So the first one is something that Matt said at the very beginning, which is if Healy, that domino effect, right? So that everybody kind of moves up, and I want to remind us that today's city councilor is probably tomorrow's state rep, is probably next week's state senator, and in one case is now our current Senate president, excuse me. So that there are a million reasons why engaging with the local as well as the state, your state elected officials matter. And as Matt pointed out, doing it as a no ask introduction is a much stronger position to be in than, hi, please give us all these things, right? The other piece that I just want to pull out here is I've posted it twice in the chat, is the link to the Healy Driscoll transition website. So there's two things. One is they are asking if you want to work for them. And so there's a portal where you can submit your cover letter and resume. And one of the areas of work is arts and culture. The other piece is they are asking for feedback. So that's, you can provide your own feedback. And one of the topics is arts and culture. So we'll be standing up a more formal letter of congratulations and urging the adoption of a lot of the policies that the Create the Vote Coalition put together shortly, that you'll have an opportunity to sign on to. But as Matt pointed out, there will be a lot of people who utilize those two portals, but we need to make sure that includes a lot of arts and cultural representatives, right? We can't take for granted that just because on the campaign trail, both Healy and Driscoll were pro-arts doesn't mean that it will be a priority. That this is the constant care and feeding, right? And so this is a direct action you can take right now. The other point, Matt, that you were talking about is like the session isn't technically over. Like 2 weeks ago, we saw the Econ Dev bill finally pass. So there are still a couple of pieces of legislation that are out there that we'll be monitoring. And then the first, after people get sworn in and, bills have to be filed. And so we're working right now, and I'll give a plug for it later, on a community conversation process to identify what bills Mass Creative should be championing. But that's another place where we'll see where a lot of bills get filed and what legislators are filing. As I mentioned in the chat, Senator Tarr is consistently filing pro-arts and pro-creative economy legislation. So we'll take a look at that too, and we can have that on the horizon. I want to just pause and see if folks have questions for Matt. No, we amazingly covered all the bases. I'm so proud of us. Look at us. Go team. All right, well, if that is the case, I'm going to transition into putting more slides on the board. But to really talk about, and Matt and David, if you're willing to stay on for just another quick moment, to talk about how do we advocate, right? And for some of us, this feels like old hat, but refreshers and drills are always helpful, right? So first of all, look up who your members of your elected officials are. That does matter, right? And recognizing, as we've talked about today, right, like what the federal government, what our federal elected officials are focused on versus what our state officials are focused on, certainly are in collaboration, but have two different sort of foci. So making sure you understand that, God bless her, Congresswoman Presley will have very little to do with the state budget process, but will certainly have a role to play in the federal appropriations process. So take a look at that. If you have a new elected official, send them a note congratulating them on being elected and introducing yourself or your organization or your creative practice, and offer yourself up as a resource, right? Say, if you ever want to know more about the arts and culture happening in your district, I'm here to help you. I'd love to talk with you about that. The other piece is that even if you have an incumbent, now is a good time to just congratulate them on their re-election, right? And to either thank them for being a strong supporter of arts and culture, or to remind them that you're there, and again, be a resource. And then the other piece is like, there are a number, and Matt already called out a few of them, but there are a number of legislative committees that directly impact our sector, and that a lot of bills get filed that will impact our sector. The first and foremost is tourism, arts, and cultural development. So, when a committee assignments are made, we will see who the chairs of those are. This current session, we have, frankly, I would say, two incredible champions. We have Chair Fiola on the House side and of Fall River, and then we have Senator Kennedy on the Senate side, focused on Lowell and his surrounding district, and both have done enormously. They've done amazing work to make sure that our needs have been taken up and cared for around the COVID-19 crisis and recovery and relief dollars. So I will be sad if they are not our chairs, because they've done really great work, but whoever those chairs are, that will be an opportunity to introduce them to you and to yourself, to your sector, and to your work. The other ones are this economic development and emerging technologies, right? That's the one that Senator Lesser used to co-chair. That matters a lot to our issues. And again, as we pointed out, Senator Lesser was a former chair of tourism, arts, and cultural development. And so he understood our issues more clearly when he was sitting in that other chairmanship. And so whoever takes that over, we may need to do some education work and some connection work. And finally, education, right? So right now, the co-chairs are Paish on the House side and Lewis on the Senate side. And again, there is an opportunity. They actually I was delighted. They co-hosted a briefing we did around some arts education data reporting that had come out about the positive impacts of arts education in Boston schools. So they are supportive of the issue, and we want to make sure they continue to be supportive of our issues. So continue to take a look at that. So then let's talk about okay, so you talk to them. But so the other thing is, right, Mass Creative is centered on this idea that many make things happen, right? When we work together, when we are sharing in messages and similar messages to our elected officials and asking for similar things, we're able to get things done, right? And that doesn't always have to just be Mass Creative's job, right? So if you're if you say gosh, I really should go to my state legislators' coffee hour. If you say I'm going to bring 3 of my friends who are also artists in their district, and just to introduce them, that would be huge, right? Because all of a sudden, it's a little less scary because you got people there. And also that legislator and their staff get to see more perspectives, and that there are more people who care about this and are care enough to show up, right? That matters a lot. The other piece is that I'm going to drop in the chat a bevy of links, brace yourselves. But these are about when we go to talk to these folks, what do we talk about, right? And I want to remind us all that there needs to be a nice, strong balance between the data that we talk about and the personal stories, right? Data engages minds, stories win hearts. And we need both. So yes, having an understanding of where the creative economy plays a very powerful role in the Commonwealth's overall economy, that is very important. But understanding that from the individual worker's perspective matters greatly. And being able to tell that story is really powerful. So I've included here some data sources so you can pull up some of that data. And then I've also included the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies put together this awesome messaging guide, which is about, it's actually, they created it to talk to more conservative, fiscally conservative members of Congress about arts and cultural issues. But I actually have started to use it with some of our legislators, and it works brilliantly. So I would heartily encourage you to take a look at that in terms of how to position arts and culture and the need for arts and culture. Then there's also the Creating Connections framework, which is another sort of like way you can talk about arts and culture in through a lot of different lenses. And finally, I've included a template that Mass Creative created around the beginning of COVID. And this template you can use to sort of lay out your story in any respect. You don't have to just use it for COVID, but being able to start with the like, here's who I am and here's who I was, then this happened, and now I am this. Is a really like quick little narrative talking point template that can help you develop your story, right? That you're trying to place alongside this data. So these are the things that I think if you're like, I want to make sure that we're starting out the session on a good foot, these are ways that you can do that. The other thing is, obviously, Mass Creative will always be here as a resource. We will be able, we'll provide you with calls to action. We will also, provide more trainings about how to have more conversations with legislators or elected officials. And so just keep on the lookout for that. I'm going to just finally finish up with the point about the fact that the next session is going to start, and all the bills that we were talking about for the last 2 years will poof disappear. And those bills will need to be refiled, or new bills will be filed. And right now, Mass Creative is really trying to figure out exactly what we should be focusing on this next session. And so to that end, we are going on a tour. I'm going on a whirlwind tour of Massachusetts to hold some policy input gatherings. And these are opportunities for you to share exactly what have been some of the challenges that you've faced in the last 3 years. What do you think? What are some solutions? We have some ideas about solutions, but we bet you have some too, and we can make our asks even stronger through that collaboration. And then finally, I've been really impressed with a lot of the innovations that have happened over the last 3 years. Things like the Trust Transfer Project that the Springfield Cultural Alliance put together. The state's Safe Streets program, which actually put a lot of money into making open outdoor dining and also investing in public art to make those spaces more vibrant and beautiful. Those are programs that could be scaled up or made permanent. And so we want to hear about some of those solutions or opportunities that we can advocate for moving forward. So we're holding 7 of those in person. We're holding 2 virtual, and I hope you will RSVP for any of those. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and for the last little bit of time, I want to open it up for questions. And David and Matt, if there are any final thoughts that you have that you're like, wait, Em, you didn't talk about this, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, Emily, I just more of a comment. The only thing I would just kind of throw out to folks, especially on the state level, is just again the interacting with legislators and staff. I think folks should the one thing that we've learned through the COVID pandemic is that they changed the way that it's kind of changed the way folks interact with their legislators. In terms of what that's going to look like going forward, it's still, I think, a little bit unclear, but I think all indications that they're going to keep some elements of this kind of hybrid world where, especially as it pertains to kind of public hearings and such. But I think the one thing I just encourage folks is, and it was on one of the decks that on the slides that Emily has, in addition to the relationship with legislators, relationships with staff, really, because again, on that kind of moving up the chain thing, a lot of folks that are legislators today started off as legislative staff. A lot of them, if a member leaves, they run for their member's seat, and so it's really to have those relationships is really key, because newsflash, as a former staffer, staffers do like most of the work. So you should, they're really the people it's really important to have good relationships with them, never don't ever take it as a slight if at the end of the day you're talking to a member's office, say, hey, the senator is not available, but we can meet. You can meet with his legislative director, you can meet with his chief of staff, that type of thing. Take the meeting. okay? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones, you have a good, productive conversation with those folks. They're the ones that are going to report back to their member. Oh, I met with Emily Ruddick. She's great. She always, on the flip side of that is if you're a jerk to staff, they're going to say, oh yeah, we met with so-and-so and they were kind of jerks. And that's all the member is going to hear. So the key is, be nice to staff. They're there to help you. A lot of them are really, really smart, and they're definitely underpaid, and they work really, really hard. So I would just kind of throw that out there as a former staffer, now runs a lobbying firm where we only hire former staffers. We don't hire former members, we hire former staffers, because they tend to be more the workhorses, and less about ego and more about kind of getting to a good outcome. So that's no knock on any of our friends who are former legislators who may be on here, or but that's just that's how we've kind of see it work out. So I just say, again, develop those relationships, and this is a relationship business. And social media is great. Relationships are more important than social media. So especially in the Massachusetts legislature. So that'd be my parting thought.
Thank you, Matt. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to first say a deep, deep thanks to David and Matt. Your insights and, insider perspectives have really helped us today. And you are both folks who I love talking policy and politics with. So I appreciate both of you today. And I want to thank all of you who attended this Zoom. This is the work, right? This is the ongoing work that we do together. And so being in community and being able to learn together is something that I just really enjoy, and I think makes all of our work stronger. So we will see you soon, and have wonderful days.